Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the welcome. I'm looking forward to an interesting debate, and I would like to begin the discussion by making some basic remarks. So, what is the state of freedom in the age of digitalization? What's the role of the state in this context? Two questions that could not be more fundamental. Both these questions I would, of course, cannot give conclusive answers to. But, first, about freedom in the digital world. Digitalization does not only have fundamental effects on people's lives and business models of the economy, no, it also challenges our understanding of freedom. To evaluate this is therefore contradictory, and some people see a fundamental threat to freedom in digitalization, and others see it as a bringer of good. Both I consider wrong. Let me, ladies and gentlemen, first speak out for freedom. Freedom in the net as well. Digitalization itself brings unimaginable new freedoms. It creates new ways for participating and new ways for democratization. Of course, the Internet is a place for freedom, in particular the freedom of communication and freedom of speech. Let's imagine that we should have to do without all what we have been getting used to so far. This understanding for years was an important debate. It was an important part of the net politics debate. Now the pendulum, in what I consider an exaggerated way, seems to be swinging in the other direction. The Internet is said to be broken, and that is just one of the more harmless variations of cyber pessimism. Many mostly connect the Internet with surveillance and manipulation, and lately as a haven for populism, for trolling and hate speech and fake news, and it's almost solely made responsible for that. Some call it an abyss. I would like to contradict this. The Internet is still the symbol for realizing freedom, democratizing knowledge, intellectual experiences, participation and communication through across national borders, which we, before that, would not have found imaginable, possible. And that will still have to be cherished and upheld. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we're not at the end of the debate, but only at the beginning. The free play of the forces must be regulated. Exercising freedom needs rules, and that is where the democratic state has to be the guarantor for freedom and democracy. Because where digitalization on the one hand creates freedoms and levels inequalities, on the other hand, it limits freedoms and creates new inequalities, but in very different ways. For example, through market force, through cyber attacks, shitstorms, escaping from regulation, the digital gap, and through algorithms and artificial intelligence. With the new freedoms come new threats to freedom. The democratic state has the role to protect, though, and has to enforce the law to guarantee the largest possible freedom of the individual. The state role to regulate itself is at least questioned by digitalization as well. Often there's a lack of legal solutions for technical challenges, or there's a lack of technical solutions for legal challenges. This particularly will apply to the challenge of the future as such, which is artificial intelligence. Most law is still created at the national or at least European level, but technology is international. So the main problem is a dilemma, a methodological conflict. The effect of new technologies are difficult to predict as technology is not fully developed and not really spread. So a regulation that is too early would therefore just block important developments. But if technology is established and deeply rooted in society, there's hardly a way to shape it, even if it has devastating consequences. The complexity of the problem gives rise to a need to fundamental answers to all these questions. Germans traditionally are friends of comprehensive codification. The German word Gesamtkonzept, maybe overall concept, is hard to translate into English. So that leads to challenges, calls for one law for the digital world, one internet law, perhaps. I'm convinced that we need special rules. We do not need special rules for the digital world. The difference between the online and offline world is simply outdated. There is no virtual world that is standing against a real one. Special rules, yes, they may be needed, but not separate rules. The law applies without limitation, which is why I'm calling, while I find the calls for a digital fundamental right unnecessary. Fundamental rights exist. They are in the German constitutions, in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, in the European Convention for Human Rights. We just have to apply it and interpret it in the context of digitalization. What we do need, though, is a digital politics that is consistent or without contradictions in its evaluation, and a strategic alignment with digital politics, getting all the actors involved to find a coordinated digital policy. We need binding rules, coherent positioning within the international context, and the use of technologies for shaping to the advantage of everyone. With this coherent digital politics, to shape this out, I would like to focus on two areas, net politics and data politics. The term net politics for years was a synonym for digital politics. But I would like to focus it a bit more and concentrate on access. But in my view, the word data politics is gaining in importance too. There are many new developments which I will get to in the second part. Now, on net politics, that of course includes the question of access to the internet. Only if everyone has equal access, the internet can fulfill its promise of freedom. Net politics also includes the creation of openness and transparency, which is pursued by open data, open content, open access, and other movements. So net politics also includes anonymity. Anonymity is one of the conditions for political and mental freedom, but it's not the only one. For many, anonymity was one of the big promises of freedom that the internet had. But now the identifiability of the individual and the options to follow them, which largely is in the hand of private companies, lead to the situation that the promise of anonymity has been moderated or relativized. Of course, there is no absolute promise for anonymity, neither offline nor online. The intent to stay anonymous cannot lead to other people not being able to see me if I walk on the street. Nothing else can apply in the online world. The use of freedom for the individual that damages the freedom of the other it must be able to pursue that. I remember that I would have to justify the right of the state to pursue crimes on the internet because it was said that that was another world where other rules should apply. Now, thankfully, that is largely over, in my opinion. The conscience that our values apply in the internet as well is meanwhile apparent. Ladies and gentlemen, there are currently two laws in the parliamentary process that contain certain contradictions in values. One of those is the telemedia law, which contains disturbers liability provisions, which is to further free Wi-Fi, but the deeds of people that use those internets is then harder to follow. The other net is the Internet Enforcement Law, and I've heard that you've talked about this at length. This is supposed to comply in social networks to remove criminal content quickly. They are also being obliged to give information to victims of personality attacks about the perpetrators. Now, the fear is that social networks will opt for deleting content without due verification to avoid fines, and that could be to the detriment of legal content. Now, both these draft laws are part of a balance, and all the objectives are in themselves understandable and correct. But while the one law, the telemedia law, will extend the options for anonymity, the other law will reduce it. Well, the one law will reduce provider liability, the other will strengthen it. And we need to ask ourselves how citizens can safely identify themselves. The further digitalization progresses, the more we see new risks. This includes theft and misuse of identities. Identification in the digital world has to be as reliable, though, as it is in the so-called real world. There are no easy solutions to that. We need trustworthy and user-friendly solutions. That's why I continue to support the electronic ID function in the ID card and the electronic residency permit. It is now possible to have the electronic identity used by NFC-able mobile phones without detriments to security, and we've been discussing the identity function. It's not an insular solution. It will soon be applicable throughout the EU, thanks to the European regulation on identification services and trust services. This is preconditions for furthering the electronic internal market. Through single rules, it will increase trust of citizens in electronic identification. The notification of that function is progressing. Other member states will follow. Ladies and gentlemen, at the interface of net politics and data politics, I would like to place the protection of privacy. Privacy is a condition for the use of freedom. If we talk about privacy, we first need to state that there is no such thing as the one privacy. Our impression of privacy has only formed in the last 150 years. And what we understand as private has been subject to social changes, and there's a very important core. It depends on place, time, and context. For that reason, the protection of privacy is not the same as data protection. Not every personal data in the sense of data protection law is also a private piece of information. The privacy legislation sadly does not distinguish between this. Let me illustrate this with an example. If you tweet, de Maiziére is holding a so boring speech, then at first this is a content of communication. For an audience like you, of course, this will be out of the question. But it's also an information that Twitter will store on a server in binary code, and with my name, it contains a piece of personal data. Now, the interesting question is this a private piece of information? Your tweet will be public. We are in a public event, and I am a person of public interest. It could hardly actually be more public. At the same time, your tweet would be under the full regulation regime of data protection law, because you would be publishing my name, a personal data, and not and in a partly private sphere. So that would be a contradiction. We wish for a free flow of information to use our freedom of information and communication. On the other hand, data protection law says that every processing of personal data is at first prohibited unless explicitly allowed. That may also be the reason why many ideas are discussed to regulate that cut across data protection, and that you could summarize as data politics. The European Commission has put forward a draft for the e-privacy regulation that is supposed to regulate electronic communication. The Commission propagates, additionally, the principle of free flow of data. That initiative is supposed to benefit the European cloud economy at first, and is mainly targeted against individual data localization laws. In an EU Consumer Protection Directive, data is for the first time going to be accepted as a kind of payment, because consumers do pay with the data often, but that leads to further contradictions in values. If everyone can sell their data, there is the risk of a sellout of privacy if the value being offered in exchange seems to be particularly attractive. In science, also legal science, ideas are sprouting for a right to produce and evaluate data which is similar to property rights. I'm skeptical here. By creating a civil property of data, we reach all kinds of contradictions. Who is supposed to own movement data that, for example, a rented car produces? The maker, the owner of the car, the driver, the maker of the navigation system, the workshop. Finally, at the EU level, the once-only principle is gaining friends. That is the idea that every citizen will only once have to reveal core data to the administration, and then no longer have to fill in forms about every interaction with administration. New terms are making the rounds. Data opulence, data variety, data sovereignty. These are all not terms in law. I do not consider them very helpful. They may sound nice, but they do not reveal what is actually meant. The topics of profiling and algorithm control cannot be separated from data either. In my view, algorithms are never neutral. Algorithmic decisions are not just made by the developers, but also by the commissioners of those algorithms. So those that create the algorithms are responsible for the results. The decisions that algorithms make have to be understandable, have to be verifiable, and in order to be subject to democratic control. Societies have the obligation to create this kind of transparency, which could be due from a combination of technology and oversight. At the end, it's a conscious political decision how much of our freedom we should hand over to algorithms. And here too, I would say, we're just at the beginning of the debate. All these suggestions I've mentioned, data politics, are not coherent yet. They're not free of contradictions in values. Some want to protect data as such, others communication. Some want to protect privacy and human dignity. Others want to give consumers further rights. Some hope for a social added value that can come from the use of data and want to make data a common commodity. Some want to just split up the field of the new revenue. Some want to rationalize and gain through efficiency. So data politics, from one design and without contradictions is needed for this. But we shouldn't just focus on data, but also on the legal values that are to be protected, the freedoms and the rights to participate of the individual, to focus on the net. And the data simply blurs the responsibilities. The network and data do not have rights and obligation, and sometimes perhaps this blurring is intentional to avoid any obligations or rights. But data politics always will have to balance the individual's freedom with the individual's protection. On the one side, there are business freedoms, freedom of the press, of the arts, of science. On the other side, the right to privacy and the general personality right, and the obligation to find violations of legal rights, pursue them, and penalize them. I asked two questions at the beginning. The first, what's the role of the state in the age of digitalization? And the answer is, to accompany the digital transformation, we need new approaches, new solutions for an old task, which is to ensure freedom and equality. And for that, we need to set the right framework with solutions that do not lead to contradictions in values. I have touched on some of the topics. It's by no means conclusive. For example, cybersecurity is the first that should be stated, the name which I did not touch on, but it's a necessary basis for any kind of digitalization. The task of the state is to give citizens and businesses in Germany protection against threats from the cyberspace and to prevent and pursue crimes in the cyberspace. So businesses will have to include IT and cybersecurity by design in their products. But it's also necessary to ensure free and self-determined agency of the individual in the digital world, and to further spread secure identification. There is all new kinds of paintings that paint the digital future in black. If you believe all this, there's no less than the loss of human dignity or freedom that the datafication of the human will lead to. The worry that carelessness and negligence will lead to a loss of freedoms and rights. A data-centric worldview is decried, and it's said that people were just following a data religion. I do not share this cultural pessimism, but also I do not share a naive optimism. I am calling for a demythologization of the debate. People have free will, they're not puppets. And we've seen how they can make themselves free from technological frameworks and conditions to. Maybe a new age of enlightenment has started, but digitalization per se is not a threat to humans. And that's how I would like to answer the first question I stated at first. What about the freedom? Digitalization empowers the human to make use of their freedoms in an efficient way, but with these freedoms, they receive new possibilities to shape, and that leads to responsibilities, which is the case for every technological progress that leads to increased freedoms. It needs the maturity of the human. Let's use and uphold it. Thank you.
Dankeschön, Herr de Maiziére. Darf ich Sie gleich zu mir bitten? Auf diesen Sessel zu meiner Seite.
Thank you, Mr. de Maiziére. Please come to this seat on my side. And then I'd also like to ask Constanze Kurz and Markus Beckedahl to join us on stage. And we will now start the second part of the session. And before moving on to the questions, where every side will have 2 minutes, and every question will have 2 answers, Markus and Constanze will have the chance to offer a brief answer to the speech. Markus, you can start. You'll have 2 minutes. Well, hello, it's good to see that this is so full. Thanks for dropping by. We also consider Republica as a space for digital and internet political discussions, so it's great if a Minister of the Interior is joining us. So obviously this is not the first speech on basics and fundamentals that I've heard from you. All of them always tend to sound like I would sign off on half of that, but then I look at the details, right? That's where the devil is hiding. And so I have a number of points where I would like to go into detail, but I don't have the time for that. So you emphasized freedom. You said that there are always many advantages and that the internet may lead to more surveillance. And yes, unfortunately, it does lead to more surveillance, not only by private actors. Even if you're not on Facebook, well, of course, it leads to more surveillance on Facebook. That's why we share opinions. But even when you deliberately choose not to use these private players, you constantly leave traces of data everywhere that are also, thanks to some of the laws you have decided upon and that you pushed in the past, then they're being collected thanks to that. And I think freedom is only possible when we can communicate without being afraid that this is something that will be used against us at some point in the future, this chilling effect. So these chilling effects happen when you know that everything you know could be used against you, and it's going to limit freedom of opinion ultimately, and I think that's a big problem. You have 18 seconds left, but Constanze can use those. Oh, great, then I'll just start and use those. Well, of course, I would like to thank you as well, and that the Minister of the Interior is joining the discussion and is facing this discussion. So I noticed two things about this speech. The interesting thing about very fundamental speeches is often what you don't mention, and I think we're looking back on a legislative period where we can look at the laws that have already been successfully pushed and been implemented. We can summarize those, but we also look at 4 years that brought clear differences in terms of how you're considering and the value judgments you make about the digital world. And one thing in this regard is IT security. There are new demands. There are new demands from the population on IT security that have not been addressed here in a very clear way. And this is something that has also been put into question by the current government, especially, for example, by the decision of your government to create a new institution that deals with questions like, for example, do we need backdoors? And that may be putting an interesting spin onto these discussions. You yourself are a victim of NSA surveillance as well, something that was not really talked about since we were almost only talking about Merkel and how she was watched and surveilled. But you also were on these lists, right? So, but almost 4 years after Snowden, the German government has not only decided to not do anything in light of these revelations. So I'm not only talking about surveillance, but also the offensive hacking methods that we have seen and about which we know much more today. But I also mean that under your lead, there has also been an enormous expansion of secret services and of secret service surveillance in Germany. And you mentioned the electronic ID that we have in Germany, or that not everyone has, because 2/3 of our population have decided not to activate it. You also mentioned another draft law that has been moved again, where suddenly you accidentally included the automated possibility for secret services to have access to biometric data included in these, right? This is one of the reasons the draft law was pushed back again. I think this is a normalization of unconditional surveillance, or surveillance that doesn't need a reason. And I think that's something that's clearly linked to your time as a Minister of the Interior. Not only did you push data retention from the beginning and basically implemented it from the very beginning, but in many other areas, you also really normalized the keeping and the saving of retention of data without any particular reason. So at the same time, the European Court of Law, European Court of Justice has also made judgments that are much more critical of these types of data retention. Thank you. The time is up. Okay, now the timer is working as well. So we'll continue like this. We have questions about internet politics, and so they're often about big, complex concepts. But of course, we're trying to put something very basic things down before we pass the word on to you. So I'll just start with the point where Constanze left off, so secret services and surveillance. So, Mr. de Maiziére, 4 years after the Snowden revelations, if you had to summarize the actual power that technical secret services do have, what would your conclusion be? So, first of all, I would like to thank you for the political echo. Of course, I would have preferred to speak for 45 minutes, maybe an hour. I understand you don't have the time for that. And then I would have made statements about these questions as well, and I'm not afraid of being asked these questions. We have had these debates previously, and I think they were usually on a good, nice intellectual level, and I think that's going to continue. So, I would prefer if you answered the question that I actually asked you. No, but I'm not trying to evade the question. Of course, secret services, intelligence services have a clear task, and this task changes when technical conditions change. On German ground, we don't want any espionage of any kind, no matter which country it is being done by. And because of that, so after Snowden and during my time as a Minister of the Interior, I introduced the 360-degree view, which means that we look into all directions. Before we didn't look in all directions. Now we know that we need to look in every direction. So maybe we need to look east a bit more than west, but we also need to look west. And I think that is something very concrete. That we also we have told some Americans that some of their people cannot stay in Germany, that we don't want things to happen in Germany that they're doing. But at the same time, I don't not that you accuse me of not being serious. Of course, we're also responsible for the security of our population, especially when it comes to the fight against international terrorism. And we need a very good and close cooperation with the intelligence services of our allies and especially the Americans. Thanks. Who of you two would like to answer? You. Okay. 1 second. Well, of course, I think there are two different ways of reacting to that. So the world has, over the past 1.5 years, the world has turned when it comes to IT security and intelligence services, because we've talked about manipulation of elections in the US, in the UK, in France. And this is something that intelligence services have been accused of. That also includes the hacking attack on the German parliament. So a lot of these attacks that are difficult to attribute, but where we're talking about how they change our political process of decision making, and in the end also our elections. And of course, nobody would be surprised that you also see yourself on the side of our partners in the US. But I also think that this is a very ambivalent stance. For example, when you said that you would like to cooperate with the Turkish secret service. And I think the role that Germany has as a strategic partner of many secret and intelligence services is quite difficult. And considering also the way the German government behaved vis-à-vis the German parliament, that tried to look into some of these and try to shed some light on some of these, some of the spying. I just want to answer something. So, of course, there are going to be dilemmas. But imagine we receive a message about an impending terror attack, and we receive it from the Secret Service in Saudi Arabia. So maybe a bit more difficult than Turkey. So should we say, oh, because we don't like your political system, we're simply going to ignore this information? So what are you going to recommend to me? Well, if you're using this reasoning, you can also take information that was obtained using torture in Syria, and you can justify using that information. Well, now you're evading my question. I'm not saying that I'm believing them, but I'm saying I can't say that I don't want to know that because I don't like the political system. So in my view, you have now turned it again, right? You've turned it towards terror. you're one of the people who are being watched and surveilled. The EU Parliament is being watched. We're not talking about terroristic threat. We're talking about structural mass surveillance that, according to the NSA's transparency report, has grown again.
Dankeschön.
Thank you.
Wir kommen zum nächsten Thema.
So now, the next topic. We're just going to continue here. So the keyword was already mentioned, the state Trojan CITES. So what is going to happen if the state is involved directly or indirectly in the development of spying software, and when the state might have an interest in developing secure gaps in security or in buying these gaps, these exploits? Well, I can answer, right? Okay. So the answer is clear. Oh, well, I'm hesitating. I wanted to criticize you for the way you're using the term state Trojan, but that's going to cost me 5 seconds, so I won't do that. So I want to say the following. We will stick to this. This is a decision that the German government has made many years ago. We're not going to use a policy of backdoors. We are against automated conditions or the usage of backdoors for security politics or security policies. That's something that's easy to say, but we adhere to that. It gets more complicated. Maybe later, once products from other states enter the German market that may have these backdoors, what do we do then? Do we ban these products? Do we warn the population? So I think that's actually the more interesting question. We don't want that. That's the first thing. Secondly, at the same time, we cannot accept that if there is an end-to-end encryption, that because of that end-to-end encryption, automatically the rule of law is technically not possible within that service and on that platform. So that means in individual cases, we need to try to access that information. So the state needs to be capable technologically of doing what it is legally allowed to do. So if, for example, the state is legally allowed to read a message, then a text, then it should also be able to do that for an end-to-end messenger conversation. So I think this is something that is absolutely necessary under legal conditions. And so we need to look into how to do that on a technical level. And that's how CITES gave us that possibility. And that's separate from development and research. So Markus, Constanze? Ah, no, now it's my turn. You can also share the time. Well, they have 4 minutes. No, they only have 2 minutes, but we need to share the time. So a core sentence of the digital agenda that you mentioned is that you want to turn Germany into encryption country #1. The only thing that we found out about that since then is that you're creating an anti-encryption agency called CITES. We think that's a bit sad, that encryption is not something that is propagated a bit more, especially where, for example, you could have enlightenment campaigns, or where you have campaigns like telling people about AIDS, right? Why you don't use those campaigns to educate people about encryption, which they could also use to protect themselves against surveillance by foreign secret services, intelligence services. Something else that you mentioned briefly, and something was also mentioned as part of the question, in the name of security, our own security agencies are creating insecurities because they're going onto the black market to buy knowledge about gaps in security, to give ammunition to our state Trojan, even if you don't think that's a good term. So the problem is, if we're doing this with tax money to attack others, then others are obviously also going to go to these black markets and are going to buy the same knowledge to attack us. So then my question is, how do you want to solve this dilemma that is being created in the name of security? And so in the name of security, you're creating this massive insecurity because this system is creating IT insecurity. If we ended this system, we automatically would create more IT security for everyone.
Well, too late.
Well, if you let the others answer first, then I can answer. But that's not the point. Next year. Okay, so I just like to note for the protocol that I would have liked to answer and have an answer for these 2 points. We'll just continue with the topic data protection. That was one of the buzzwords in your speech. The German government propagates data richness. What does that have to do with data reform, and what do you mean when you say that, and which data is supposed to make who rich? So I mentioned that I don't really think that's a good idea, and neither do I think a lot about data sovereignty. I don't think that's a good idea either as a term. So of course you can't say the government is propagating that. This term is a term that is used for fights and conflicts in this internet political debate. And I think saving data, that's a term that you also need to be careful and need to avoid. So let's assume when you look at the relation between the citizen and the state, then there is a datum, a point of information for every point, for different needs, right? So you can say that's a way of saving data because different agencies don't know what the other agencies know. But also at the same time, every citizen always needs to send their data to every single institution. So the risk is actually much bigger. So there's the once-only principle, which is one of the reasons why we're considering a national portal where it's going to be centralized, where it's going to be much easier to see from where people access this. So then what does this refer to, this idea of saving?
Data minimization.
Data minimization. And the second thing, we have many good usages of data and of information where we use them together in a good and an intelligent way, and nobody has anything against that. So I think neither the idea of data minimization nor of data richness is something that we should declare as void. So I think we are using a risk-based approach. So you look, for example, of whether something is personally identifiable data, whether it's linked directly to an individual, and what you can do with the accumulation of this information. And that's why I said this data point in itself is not the problem, but information and protection of privacy is more important than a fetishized discussion about terms like data minimization. Markus, Constanze? So I think one of the things that you just said is about utility, right? But as always, I would also like to talk about this in a much more fundamental way. Something that we saw over the past legislative period is definitely a fundamental change in terms of the attitude towards this whole data protection topic, something that is being defended by you and also by Chancellor Angela Merkel, also Mr. Gabriel and Mr. Dobrindt. We also see that when we look at the papers of the usual management of the usual consulting firms. But today, data minimization is also a safe way of IT security, right? Because once you're compiling data, that's a danger because our computer systems are very insecure. So as long as we don't solve this problem of IT security, which is not going to be solved anytime soon, data minimization is also a protection in a very different way. And I think we really need to separate utility in terms of different data, right? In terms of personal information, in terms of other useful information that we would like to use. This is something that this has become more important in the way it is linked to the way you should have sovereignty and agency over your own data. And that is also opposed to the stance that we've heard from this government. And you've all put a lot of work into decreasing some of these rights, right? And you've only changed that after you've gotten a lot of criticism. So you've implemented a lot of these things. And I think it's going to be likely that we see similar things with the e-privacy rules. Something similar is going to happen in terms of a debate in the next legislative period. And it is important to me that we don't let data protection go into this weird corner in an ideological way, but that we talk about it in a way that of what it actually is, which is a protection of human rights and basic rights. Thank you.
We'll have one more question on the panel, but before we then open it up to a Q&A and your questions. Now, we'll stick with those topics, the open data complex, that we will extend it to that. So what does the government do in concrete to further open data? I hope that within this legislative period, we will be able to pass the open data law that we put forward, and that will have a number of consequences. There will be advisory institutions. The administration will have to be driven to get active. And I believe that the decisive breakthrough will be achieved in the last few meters of this legislative period with the open data law. You will say it's too late, but we will get it going. And this will be unprecedented. If every minister says that, well, in my ministry, I will have an open data terminal, you can get my weather data, well, that's very nice. There's nothing against that. But you have to have a more systematic approach, and that's what we will do. And I think that will be an important result of this legislative period. 1:11 left. Can I? If you like, you can talk about something else. I'll keep my time for some replies later. Okay. Your turn. Well, it's nice that the government will want to pass an open data law in this legislative period. Well, the government has passed it. It's Parliament. Well, if the Grand Coalition managed to pass it, but it's a bit late, and it's a bit half-hearted to the way it was made. You'd have to think much more radically, much more information that's in the administrations and authorities by themselves in an automated way have to be put online. We have the situation that we have a freedom of information law, but in practice, citizens are still kind of kept in a beggar's kind of attitude. We need to dare much more towards a transparency law that would open everything that administrations do and turn it around completely, and basically publish as much as possible and only think about the exceptions, because what we are now talking about are the exceptions when things are published. Because if we are supposed to use our freedom of information laws, we will first get denials and then have to go to the courts to see if there will be an exception for once, and that's not how it can continue. Okay, I believe we can put the heart back on the screen, because I will now get over to you and ask you to ask as short questions as possible. You will see in the middle of the room there's one microphone, and on the other side, please raise your hand. Another nice person with a microphone. You can walk up to these people and line up behind them in an orderly fashion, please, and introduce yourself. One thing, if you start to make comments, we reserve the right to just shut you off, okay? First one with your name, please.
Well, hello, my name is Patrick Schiffer. I'm a member of the Pirate Party in Germany. I'm the chairman here. And I would like to mention a few things. Some of these things might make you feel insecure. So the Pirate Party Germany is for the first time giving you the Golden Shit Award, which our main candidate for the following elections is giving to you. Is that a question? The question is, if we are not Burka, what are we?
Well, maybe afterwards, okay? Next question, next intervention, please. I can reply for 2 minutes, right? It's not a surprise that the privates are vanishing from federal state parliaments overall across the board.
Well, hello, my name is Daniel Lücking. I'm a freelance journalist. dear Minister, you're collecting a lot of information for the internal security. You would collect more if you could. How do you justify the fact that you have a lot of information where, for example, the fingerprint of every single refugee that came to Germany is collected, but that you do not have a place where the fingerprints of every person who has access to ammunition or could potentially use weapons, or of all those people who own weapons because they work for the state, that includes the police, the army. Why is there no information? Why is there no database on these people? Why do you not consider that part in a question of internal security in Germany?
Thank you for that question. Concerning the question of registering and the core data system for refugees, we, or in particular I, were massively criticized for the fact that 10,000 refugees came every day at a time, and with great support from the general public and without criticism from data protection commissioners, introduced this. We do not want any social fraud, social securities fraud. We want to know who comes and who deserves protection, or that first point. Second point, we hope that within this legislative period we'll be able to strengthen gun laws. We are in the final stages of debating that. And there's supposed to be an automatic merging of information from the Interior Secret Service of the federal level and the federal states level about extremist information with the files at the gun control administration, so that these administrations can withdraw guns from some of these people. We want to disarm the right extreme Reichsbürger movement who deny the existence of the German state. So we have unity on that. Now, as far as police and soldiers and all that are concerned, these are people that act on behalf of the state, that for themselves have a concrete weapon, and it's a real problem if they ever lose it. It's very clear who has which weapon. There are severe disciplinary measures. So, therefore, to be honest, the administration really knows the individual police person or soldier. So, the protection against misuse of weapons with soldiers, police people, customs officials, and whoever has weapons is completely ensured. And the other groups that have been touched on? Refugees, no. The question was people that own weapons, guns. Why is there one category and for some people and another for others? Well, the weapons register has comprehensive information about the owners of these weapons. This is more about the reliability and less about knowing who they are. Would you like to comment on this in any way, or shall we move on? Okay, we move on.
Well, hello. My name is De Puppe. I'm a data protection commissioner and information security manager. I was very happy to hear that the government and you don't want to use backdoors. I have just one further question. Is an exploit that is only known to intelligence services and can be used by them actively, isn't that a backdoor for these intelligence services?
Well, if I'll include the response to Mr. Beckedahl in this. If there is a security exploit, a security flaw, and under the conditions of the rule of law, security authorities use it, I don't have a problem with that. What I have a problem with, and I've said that on behalf of the whole government, is that we will not create such backdoors. We will not compel makers to give us our basic algorithms or create backdoors and everything that you know in this context. Now, Mr. Beckedahl also said something else. He said, well, the state can go to the black market or certain companies and buy up information and therefore worsen security holes. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's correct to found it CITES, the institution that researches security holes, because I find it correct that the state does this research itself or buys information under clear conditions where it's very clear that it will be used under the rule of law, which is much better than individual authorities trying to acquire things that maybe will then be misused by others. Would you like to comment on this?
Well, we can also call that something different, right? The state is subsidizing this black market and gray market. Even today, the companies that are selling these things, both the gaps in security and the exploits, those are being paid by tax money, right, by state money. And now you want to put even more tax money and state money into that market, which then hits the citizens the other way around. So this year, for example, the parliament, this year we got a unique insight into the toolbox, the hacking toolbox of some intelligence services. Some of you may remember that was interesting, but something that was even more interesting was the political side of this. In the US, there are very clear rules on when intelligence services can use exploits, and once they have to disclose them towards the people who are controlling them, and once they have to disclose them to the companies who are usually from the US. And they have not adhered to any of these rules. And an important thing is also that for us with CITES, the cooperation between intelligence services and the police is super soft and vague, as always. And my trust in this, also considering the way the parliamentary inquiry into the NSA spying went, into the lawful behavior of intelligence services when it comes to using offensive tactics, my trust in them is zero, right? So also when you, for example, look at the way the person who is in charge of the German Constitutional Protection Service, right, who you are in charge of, this guy said that we need to hack back. But against who do you want to hack back, right? You still have the problem of attribution. Same with the German parliament hack. Who do you hack back? But ultimately what happens is that this money is being poured into this market of security exploits. I think that's wrong, and I think it's dangerous.
Mrs. Kurz, you will then have to answer the question that I'm putting, and whether the state should have no options at all, in which it could do in the analog world, so to say, to use those in the digital world, because that would mean that criminals, terrorists, would have options that to use communication that is simply not observable, which I find wrong. So, speaking of the darknet, of course, we will have to use covered investigators in the darknet to trace illegal gun trade. I see that you nod there. I see you nodding. So this will transcend limits that we have to talk about. Am I allowed to buy a gun or sell a gun this way? To pretend to do so, to get at these people, and we've discussed all this in the context of child pornography and others. So I don't want you to say. I would not like if you say with your criticisms in a fundamental way that encryption means that the state is per se not supposed to be able to access this kind of communication. I would find it highly dubious.
Just a very quick answer, so we have time for a few more questions. So now you push that towards the complete opposite extreme, right? So if you don't do this way of subsidizing the gray and black market, then you can't do anything. And I think that's a false dichotomy, and you know that, right? There are going to be areas of technology where intelligence services and the police simply will be technologically incapable of reading these things. You already have that when it comes to analog communication. I really think the state has given itself a lot of possibilities in terms of surveillance that it's going to build upon technologies. But the question is whether structurally, right, you want to subsidize this market. You are planning to have 400 people there, and there still is the German army that also wants to enter this section. I don't think you can simply push it over onto the other side. And I think it's a fact that there are going to be things that you simply can't access. And you also mentioned that these companies that offer this end-to-end encryption, especially these big companies, that you support these companies. You also said that you think they are important. And I don't think this dilemma can be solved.
Well, that is a dilemma. It's something that we have to balance and deal with responsibly. We are allowed to overdraw by 5 minutes, but we have only 2 further questions that you can ask. Please ask them sharply, and you can start to prepare your other questions under the hashtag Digitalpolitik17. Digitalpolitik is like the digital politics word in English, but a K at the end.
My name is Henning Tillmann. Hello. Good to see you here. I have a very current politics question. Today, your cabinet decided to expand data retention to break-ins. So in 2015, the law only mentioned that it's going to be used for very grave crimes. So nobody talked about home break-ins. So is this the first step? And which other expansions of this could you imagine? People who insult other people, people who go over the speed limit. What else could you imagine to expand this law to?
Thank you for that question, because unfortunately there is a misunderstanding that you probably don't have, but in the debate that was an important misunderstanding. The set of data when data retention is not going to be enlarged. It's not about the question of saving login data or storing login data. No, sorry, Ms. Kurz, it's not about storing additional login data. In paragraph 100, used by providers, they can store under their own guidance, but this is a misunderstanding. I should clear up. I'm not saying that without reason, because in the debate with the coalition partner, there was a misunderstanding at some point in time, and it was said to be our demand. It was not, just to make that clear between us, right? The only thing we are doing, the catalogue of crimes, of offences, in a certain section, the crimes of burglary in private apartments as a crime for the use of the existing set of data in data retention can be used. I consider that correct. And otherwise, the international organized crime will not be able to be resolved. We have one of the lowest detection rates internationally, below 20%, and that is often because the structures of such burglaries cannot be enlightened, because we need data retention for that. Of course, this was included in the catalogue in 100G, Section 2.
Well, in that case, we're happy that you didn't expand how long data retention is going to be effective, but only the access to this information. So for the first time, before this German Constitutional Court made a decision on this new version of data retention, and before it can make a decision on that, but you presented it as something very simple. But for example, the way you're using cell towers doesn't mean anything else. But the fact that if there is a home break-in somewhere, then the security agency can simply call the provider and say, I want the information of all the numbers and the data on all numbers that were logged into that cell tower at this particular point of time. And so if you look at how many break-ins we have, then every single citizen in Germany is going to be included in this at least once per week. And so their information is going to be saved somewhere, and they're going to be compared to whether they were involved in anything like this before. So the cell tower inquiry says you're saving for 4 weeks, you're saving where we were and where our phones were, and you just expanded access to that. So this includes who was where with whom, and you can use that data to figure out where you're going tomorrow.
So where's your criticism in this?
So my criticism is that this is completely unproportionate.
Well, no, I have to. We've been debating this a long time, and of course you are going to say that even with data retention, we have found a compromise that is about the miles kind of data retention all over Europe.
Well, then please thank the Constitutional Court, which has given you these rules and which has laid down these rules for you.
We'll take one more question from the center. Okay, but I have to say, that's a very, very interesting sentence. Thank the Constitutional Court for that, to have made those rules. So you conclude from that the new rules, do you expect the Constitutional Court to no longer repeal them?
No, but you made these rules in such a narrow way because you're hoping that these rules, because they're so narrow, are potentially going to be accepted by the Constitutional Court.
Correct, yes. I don't like to lose at the Constitutional Court that much. Sure.
Well, Mr. de Maiziére, thank you for participating in this debate. So you were talking about this 360-degree perspective earlier. But when it comes to the parliamentary inquiry into the NSA, we all know that, for example, the National Commissioner for Data Protection actually tried to control intelligence services and tried to control the way the data protection laws were implemented there. So then why did you not strengthen this colleague of yours and enable her to actually implement this in the proper way? Because what we could read online on German websites is that they were denied access to certain systems, and you did not strengthen her and you did not support her, and that's how you showed that you're perfectly willing to support intelligence services in doing these things without any external control.
Well, the Data Protection Commissioner is not a subsidiary institution under my control. Through a law in this legislative period, on the basis of EU law, she has been made a completely independent institution. De facto, she had been that, but now institutionally, she is completely independent. She is joined to the German Parliament, and through the data protection regulation of the EU, she will receive further rights, which haven't been debated a lot. So these are rights to raise complaints, which hasn't been the case at the federal level. So the basic condition of your thesis, I would say that a member of a subsidiary institution would have been commanded by myself not to do something that is completely misguided, and the Data Protection Commissioner would simply refuse if I made any conditions.
Thank you so much. My name is Julia Probst. You already know me. We met about a year ago, and I'm talking about the situation of people who are deaf. At the time, the German government said that there would be a central hotline in the form of an app. And I have the question in terms of data protection. How is this data protection going to work? I would rather not have an app. As someone who's deaf, I would rather just have the way of sending a text. Many people who are deaf do not have a possibility of sending out an emergency call without a phone, right? Whether that is for a medical emergency or the police. So I have a question for you. How do you imagine security of citizens when it comes to data protection? So I do not feel safe. The way you want to do this with an app, this is not for me. I can't do anything with that.
Well, I can't answer the question spontaneously, I'm afraid. I cannot. It's a very specific question. Yes, we did indeed talk about this, the fact that deaf people or hearing impaired people might have a problem with acoustic signals in cases of emergency, though that led to the suggestion of an app. And I think it is being worked on, but what the details are, I cannot say. And I suggest that one of my colleagues will come to you and, with your consent, will get your contact data, and I will then gladly inform you about the latest state of affairs, and to also include this perhaps as a request, and hopefully next year at the next dialogue you report how things will be. If I'm getting invited, it would be nice if you came to us again. Yeah, it's nice for you to have put yourself to this dialogue. Thank you for that.